This episode, I'm joined once again by Aaron French to discuss the work of Max Stirner, Rudolf Steiner, and Individualist Anarchism. I'd like to say a big thank you to all my paying patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible. And if you'd like to keep the podcast running, please find links for the Patreon in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy. So, Aaron French, thanks once again for joining me on Hermitix podcast.
Thanks for having me back.
We are going to be discussing once again the work of Rudolf Steiner, esotericist. We are going to be discussing it, though, in relation to the philosopher Max Stirner, primarily known for the ego on its own, or the unique and its property, as it's translated by Wolfie Landstreicher. And listeners will know that I've recently had a couple of episodes on Stirner, and also I've done a couple of talks on Stirner's book. And they will know from those conversations that Max Stirner was an influence to certain thinkers, Camus, Marx, various others. But even on those bigger names, the influence has pretty much been washed away from history, and you have to spend a lot of time to find Stirner's direct influence on figures. So even more so on the likes of Rudolf Steiner, who in his book on Nietzsche is where he writes the most about Max Stirner and this relationship to egoism, this relationship to anarchism, and we could say to be a little complex, the philosophical foundations of Steiner's politics. But it does need to be said that Rudolf Steiner's politics go through a long evolution that does have phases and does have clear points of interest: anarchism, socialism, utopianism. And there is a wealth of history here with a wealth of figures and an explosive history. So this is the place we're going to begin, which is post-World War I history. So really the history of the time between World War I and World War II, which is often kind of overlooked for obvious reasons, but actually in itself is this basically historic period that can only be described as cultural, political, and religious and spiritual dynamite. Just anything and everyone is having a go at whatever the hell it is. But not to go too deep, we're talking about things like Dada, Steiner, Theosophy, Magic Order of the Golden Dawn. Figures like Junger are writing their books. Figures like Spengler are writing their books. There's just, and Gurdjieff is doing his thing. So there is an explosion on all counts. So that's where we're going to begin. But Aaron, you came to this through a paper that you wrote, I believe.
Yeah, thanks also for giving me the opportunity to talk about this subject, because the idea of Steiner and Stirner is known, but it's perhaps not well known, and the extent of it is not. It's only in certain writers or certain circles probably known at all, unless most people encounter Steiner just through Waldorf or through esotericism, and to hear about his connection to something like anarcho-individualism might seem strange, but it's related to this context and this history you're talking about. And so, yeah, I wrote a paper on this, particularly in the German context, on this period you're talking about. And the paper is called Esotericism Against Capitalism, Rudolf Steiner's Reform Pedagogy as a Site of Resistance. And the paper was just published this year it's open access in a journal called Approaching Religion. And so I had avoided this period, to be honest, or at least this quote-unquote political side of Steiner, and the educational side, because it's so vast and convoluted. And I was always more interested in his philosophy, his esoteric ideas. But through this paper, I had to drill down into these ideas more. And so that's what the paper is about. But in terms of bringing us to Steiner and anarchism, it's probably in the German context, because that's where Steiner is coming out of. This goes back even earlier to around the turn of the century, because Steiner was living in Weimar from 1880 until 1887. 1890 until 1897, and then he moves to Berlin, and then he has a kind of another period there. And these are like his more quote unquote radical moments. Then he officially joins the Theosophical Society in 1902. But this period here is what we want to look at. And there's a one historian named Kevin Repp who wrote a book about this period, and he refers to something he calls the generation of 1890. I use this in my dissertation also, and he says that this particular generation, and this was also Steiner's generation, they were all inspired by the proclamation that Kaiser Wilhelm II gave in 1890, and these were some social reform decrees. And he basically introduced or popularized this idea of the quote-unquote the social question. And so although later the Kaiser eventually becomes like a conservative, representing a conservative position, especially in this World War I, the essence of these decrees was nevertheless progressive. This is Repp's argument, and they focused on peaceful relationship between workers, fair relationship between employees and employers, and equal rights before the law. So this idea of the social question, this really occupies a large part of Steiner's lecturing and writing, even though you might not notice that at first if you didn't kind of know more of this German history background. And in Repp's account, he introduces a lot of individuals who are like Steiner from this generation of 1890 who wanted to make a difference. They wanted to rectify social injustice in the modern world, but at the same time, they wanted to hold on to the benefits of modern science and technology. So Steiner is totally involved in this project. And there are, as you've mentioned, there are like a multitude of different ways that people went about doing this. Not, I mean, all over it, but and even in the German context, there's just like a ton of different approaches that people were going after to try to address the quote unquote the social question. But when World War I breaks out, this changes everything, obviously. And I think we'll come back to, I think it'll be important to go back to the 1890s for Steiner, because this is where he begins with Stirner. But the fruits of it, in a certain sense, come after World War I, because after World War I, Steiner introduces a political project. And up to that point, he hadn't really been doing that. He'd been doing theosophy, he'd been writing, he'd been a Goethe scholar. World War I happens, and in the middle of World War I, he's coming up with this political idea, and he even tries to like meet with some high up generals in Austria or politicians and in Germany to try to like get this project. He thinks this project kind of saved the situation, and it doesn't work. Mm-hmm. And after World War I, he then is basically doing it on his own, or doing it kind of in a grassroots kind of way or something. And it's not just him doing it, because of the breakdown in Germany after the First World War, so-called November Revolution, where the army's mutiny and everything. Steiner's there doing his political project, but you have the communists and the socialists of various stripes, very strong, also going for their project. You do have the nationalists. These were sometimes referred to as the chauvinists at the time. And then you have, the communists and the anarchists, all, especially in Germany at this point, like vying for power. And then the Social Democrats kind of win, at least in this period, win in quotes, and you establish the Weimar Republic, which eventually leads to World War II, and that's kind of another history. But this is the background that one has to keep in mind when thinking about Steiner. But as I mentioned, his connection to individualist anarchism is actually starting in the 1890s.
And there's another biographical element, I believe, that we sort of need to bring in. Well, not need to bring in, I mean, but it's overlooked, I think, in a way, largely because, and this is in relation to Stirner and Stirner's only biographer. So for those that haven't listened to the previous talks, Max Stirner, the biography of Max Stirner, which I believe is called Max Stirner, His Life and Work, is 200 pages long by a chap called Mackay, John Henry Mackay. And when I say 200 pages long, well, it's one of those old books with wide margins. So reduce that to 100 pages. And only about half of it is really actually related to Stirner himself. The other is related to the group that he was sort of part of in a cafe, and then the time. So we have about 40 pages of biography on Max Stirner, which is a relatively uneventful life. There is only about 2 years in Max Stirner's life which are eventful, which are the years around the publication of The EU on its Own. The reason I'm saying this, of course, is because John Henry Mackay, who wrote this biography, of Max Stirner, but didn't know Stirner, who wrote this biography of Stirner. So he's one of the few people at this time who really knows Stirner's work well, was the best man at... Hang on.
Yeah.
Rudolf Steiner was... No, the other way around. Mackay was the best man for Rudolf Steiner. So they were very close. So here is I guess a textual biographical connection of Steiner himself actually to the history of Stirner's philosophy. So there is the... Is this where Steiner first becomes Stirner?
Yeah, for the most part, I would say yes. It's a little bit, it's not 100% clear to me if Steiner hadn't already picked up some ideas, because he was, widely read, and the moment when he's writing things that sound like Stirner, he's also into Nietzsche, but he does meet John Henry Mackay at the same time. So there's this, and this is all around 1893.
Yeah.
So there's this like confluence of people coming together and ideas around Steiner's life. To try to pinpoint exactly how he was introduced to it, I don't know that that's known, or at least I don't know it in terms of if he read it first. But like in his autobiography, Steiner says something like, he mentions this at the end of his life. He wrote an autobiography, and he mentions back in the 1890s when I was around, these anarchist people, and he does mention that his understanding of Stirner and his relationship to Stirner was associated with his friendship with Mackay.
And he also mentions that these were some of the most important things he ever wrote, if not the...
Yeah.
He never really gets beyond this, and this is very... He obviously does a lot more, but in the biography, in his own biography, it seems that even though this was so long ago in relation to the philosophy of freedom, which we might get to next, this, all the way through his life, even right at the end, he says this holds...
Yeah.
Am I right in thinking he said he'd never really got... This seems to just be so important to him, which is really surprising, right?
Yeah, well, the way that I guess it's framed is more like he does to a certain extent later disavow, I don't say disavow, but puts the proper distance between himself and some of his earlier ideas about anarcho-individualism. Nevertheless, he republishes it. He puts out further editions of the philosophy of freedom, and he maintains all the way, it's still maintained in anthroposophical circles, that the philosophy of freedom is like the central text of Steiner's thought, of the movement. It's the foundation to do any of the later esoteric stuff. So philosophically, I think, that towards the end of his life, he did still feel like this was his main contribution that was important. And in my opinion, it is important. There is derivative aspects to it, for sure, like philosophy historians or something would show us that. But when you combine it with the later esoteric insights, which were the product of his own mystical and like occult experiences, you do arrive at a mystical anarchist philosophy, which is unique, and that's why it's interesting. A critique of this is that towards the end throughout his life, Steiner was attacked heavily. I'm currently writing about this. The amount of just opponents that he was up against was, and this whole time is like that. As we mentioned, it's a very explosive time. So he was right in the thick of it. And he, it's sometimes argued that his holding to his philosophy of freedom as so important, which he wrote back in the 1890s, was a way to counteract arguments that were saying look, you used to be a philosopher and now you're the spiritual guru. You're what's going on here? Or it's like a critique that he basically was like an opportunist and went into theosophy because he couldn't make it as a philosopher, things like this. So it's almost like he's trying to put forward the claim that, no, this was all one development, and that moment in my life, which I agree with this, and I could give you we could talk about why I think it's technically true that he did this anarchist moment and then went into the spiritual stuff and then tried to show the continuity throughout his life.
Do you mind if we just stay with the philosophy of freedom?
Sure.
How would you, take your time, how would you just, so background on this text, I believe he was 26 when he published this. I think I've got that right. So extremely young, and
I think he was in his 30s.
Okay.
Actually.
Oh.
Yeah, early 30s.
Early 30s. So
Still young, yeah.
Still young, I say as a 30-year-old man. Still young. And one thing that should be said about this, I guess, from what you're saying with regards to those later critiques is it's not only a bold text in itself, in its own content, but what Steiner is really saying he's doing with that is probably the boldest statement one can make in philosophy. And he is one of the, let's say, characters of philosophy who's said that they've done this, who's been overlooked. And that is the completion of German idealism. So at 30, early 30s or whatever it is, with the philosophy of freedom, he is saying that he's completed the system of German idealism, and he was obsessed with Kant. And
overcoming Kant.
Overcoming Kant.
Obsessed with overcoming Kant.
So, in the sense it's a Stirnerian text, or influenced by Stirner, is Stirner the completion of the system of German idealism?
That's interesting. I mean, in terms of overcoming Kant, the idea is about overcoming the dichotomy or the separation between the noumenal and the phenomenal world.
Right.
Steiner puts forward in this book that this is possible, that there is a way to reunite within the ground of being, or what he calls the world all, and this then dissolves this subject-object illusion, and therefore you are, in the reality in itself to some extent. And he has a whole program through free thinking that he says can do this, but this focus on free thinking and individuality is indeed inspired by Stirner and Mackay, who he's involved with Mackay at the time, and Benjamin Tucker is an American individualist anarchist who was a friend of Mackay. They were all buddies, at this time, in correspondence. It was corresponded with each other. So that background is for sure underpinning the philosophy of freedom. And so maybe if I could say something about how Steiner came to know Mackay and what he said about it, because he says some things in the Nietzsche book, as you mentioned, but in his letters you can find him saying more. So as I mentioned, from 1890 to 1897, he's in Weimar. He publishes The Philosophy of Freedom in 1893, late 1893. This then puts him in contact with Mackay, with Benjamin Tucker, as I mentioned, and Steiner sends Mackay a copy of a exemplar copy of The Philosophy of Freedom. And he says in the letter attached, this is a quote from Steiner, that this book represented the philosophical foundation for Stirner's conception of life, which is in complete agreement with the statements in the book, Der Einzige und sein Eigentum. So he sends this to Mackay, basically saying, this book is the Stirner's conception of life, Weltanschauung, probably he's using something like that. This is the philosophical foundation for his ideas that I wrote. That's kind of how he's seeing it. The next year, though, he publishes his book on Nietzsche. And this is called A Fighter Against His Time in the English.
What year was this published?
This 1895.
1895. This would be in German.
Yeah, published in
German. So this would be one of the earliest books on Nietzsche.
Yeah, and Nietzsche was, of course, there was popular at the time as I don't know what to call it, like a kind of mystical hero for some. He had a cult following already, though. And there's something to say about Steiner's. Some people accuse Steiner of being part of that. He himself said he was not part of this, but he nevertheless did admire Nietzsche.
And if you want more on that, go listen to our discussion with Paul Bishop, where we talk about that more.
Absolutely. Yeah. So interestingly, though, this book, in this book, it's like as though he started off being very interested in Nietzsche, but by the end of it, he comes to prefer Stirner's ideas and anarcho-individualism as being more connected to his own philosophical ideas. And in the passage in the Nietzsche book, he basically says something like this, like Nietzsche is doing what Stirner already got right. I can't remember the exact quote, something like that. But in the same year he publishes this Nietzsche book, there's another interesting thing he says in a letter to one of his friends, a feminist writer named Rosa Mayrader. And this is again 1895, and he says to her, quote, "I find in Stirner an energy of life, an artistic cheerfulness and artistic freedom, which do not seem to be present in Nietzsche. With Stirner, one breathes an even purer air than with Nietzsche. The perspective of life that Nietzsche strives for is realized in Stirner. So you can see him like, having this affinity for Stirner's ideas and for this anarchist position, although he adds his own like philosophical, ideas and components to it as well. But if I could I'm going to move forward with this story. So this is happening when he's in Weimar. He writes the book. He's sort of getting involved with this anarchist circle. He's reading Stirner. He has some contact with Nietzsche even, and he almost takes over the archive there, and that ends in a disaster, which is another story. But he seems to switch his focus from Nietzsche is so great to this Stirner anarcho-individualism stuff. And when both Steiner and Mackay settle in Berlin in 1898, this is when they develop what Steiner called, at the end of his life in the autobiography, a beautiful friendship. So even then, he still values this friendship at the end of his life, but he says there's something like, my public presentation of anthroposophy destroyed this friendship. Like a lot of leftists, he was very involved in radical leftist politics, and a lot of these leftists didn't like him, the spiritual direction he went, according to him. Yeah. So that made some problems in his relationships. But anyway, in this 1898 in Berlin, the two of them, Mackay and Steiner, they begin to publish favorable accounts of of each other's anarchistic works, individualist anarchist works, and in this kind of open letters thing. And then also in 1899, they collaborate on publishing Mackay's translation of Benjamin Tucker's pamphlet called Are Anarchists Murderers? Are Anarchist Murderers? So Mackay, I think, translates this, and they publish this with these open letter exchange that they'd been doing. And this the same year, by the way, as you mentioned, Mackay is the best man at Steiner's wedding to his first wife. So I have a quote here from Steiner's letter that he expresses his own position. So I thought we could read that. And this was published first in the magazine that he was editing in Berlin before it was published in this political pamphlet. This is 1898. And it was published shortly after the Empress Elizabeth of Austria had just been assassinated in one of these propaganda of the deed or propaganda der Tat anarchistic acts. This happened in Geneva. And so public perception of anarchists was not very favorable at this time. It was more and more becoming associated with terrorism and so on. There's a whole history to that we could talk about if we wanted. But it's at this point that Steiner then suddenly decides to publicly come out, so to speak, as an anarchist, which is also interesting. So again, this 1898. And but he makes this very important distinction about pacifist anarchism and this like propaganda der Tat, this action through perhaps violence, form of anarchism, which was becoming more and more a thing. So anyway, here's the quote from Steiner, what he says, and this is a response to Mackay in a published open letter. He says, if I were to say, in the sense in which such things can be decided, whether the word individualist anarchist applies to me, I would have to answer with an unconditional yes. The individualist anarchist wants that no human being should be hindered by anything from being able to develop the abilities and powers that lie within them. The state prevents the individual from developing these abilities at every turn. It hates the individual. It says, I can only use a person who behaves in such and such a way. Anyone who is different, I will force them to become what I want them to be. Now the state believes that people can only get along if they are told you have to be like this. And if you are not like that, then you have to be like that. The individualist anarchist, on the other hand, believes that the best condition would result if people were given freedom from compulsions and restrictions. The individualist anarchist has the confidence that people will find their own way. End quote. So he publicly basically makes a statement, this is my position.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's done in relation with Mackay, as you mentioned, so it's very much inspired by that relationship, I think.
Mm. So the tougher question there, because thus far, you know, in a way, any political figure could have written such a thing, but the fact is Rudolf Steiner, primarily known for his spiritual and esoteric work, where does that angle begin to come in with regard to one being an individual? You know, are we to be individual, anarchist, enlightened Are we to be enlightened individual anarchists? Is there a connection there between the evolution of the spiritual evolution of the self and to be an individualist anarchist?
Yeah, and this is again where this problem of continuity is such a big theme, like in Steiner studies. Like, was he just doing what was popular at the time and then shifted everything to theosophy, and then, which was also popular at the time, or is he like having like, which he argues he was, a philosophical development and a personal development that led him to each one of these ideas. And the one thing about the philosophy of freedom that is different or colored by something else than just some other anarchist writing, individualist anarchist writing it or something, is Steiner's background in Goethe. So prior to writing this, he was working and editing Goethe's scientific papers. So he is definitely one of the first people to point out that Goethe's scientific writings are important. They're not just the funny pseudoscience of a poet, in other words. Like he said, no, there are actually theories in here that are important for science. He characterized them in a kind of more mystical way than perhaps Goethe would. I don't know. One could argue about that, but that background then comes in and it gets attached to this philosophy of freedom idea. So it's hard to describe, to be honest, but at least the two pictures you can perhaps get what I mean here. That Goethean science is about kind of direct engagement with nature. The experiencing of the objects in nature in themselves, in a certain sense, in an organic, holistic sense, doing what one can to erase the subject in the study, in the scientific study, pushing into the nature. And the individuality part is also about that, but it's about into the human, inside. So he kind of puts these two things together, and it's very complicated, obviously, but one of the things he's saying and trying to argue in that book is that the process of doing that reunites the individual with like the ground of being, the individual I with the world I, or what he sometimes calls the world all. Yeah, so it's heavily influenced by German philosophy, Goethe, the anarchists, but it's his own brew, his own cocktail that he's making there, which becomes even more interesting then when he throws a bunch of theosophy fruits and vegetables in,
Well, there's sort of a strange irony as well with the theosophy angle, because obviously Steiner does eventually sort of leave theosophy, but, there's a conversation with John Michael Greer recently where he, as far as he's concerned, the end of theosophy is because of Krishnamurti being brought up and heralded as the Messiah, and then they have this big meeting brought together by Adi Besant, and Krishnamurti basically, in it, the reason I say the irony is it's kind of an individualist anarchist position where he basically says, like, you don't need a religion, you don't need a group, you can only do this yourself. Maybe this is something that Steiner actually saw when amidst the, who's to say, but there is a sort of recursive irony there that they all came to the same position of you can only do this yourself.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is interesting. And again, he did hold that line, even as he was taking on the theosophical language and everything. He clearly loved philosophy, German idealism, and so he held that attached to this new theosophical ideas that he was also developing, which eventually became anthroposophy, which is still very much a kind of theosophical system, but it's his own version of it.
So, yeah. So how does this develop for Steiner? Would you say he remains an individualist anarchist type politically until the end of his days?
Yeah, yes and no. Yes, on the one hand, he definitely does, but part of one of the other reasons why I would say theosophy ended was because of World War I. All of those theosophists thought that the next great age was coming, and instead they all went to war with each other and then they started forcing each other to pick sides. And then you had to determine which side was working for the White Lodge and which for the Black Lodge, like Twin Peaks or something. So that really destroyed. Up to that, they were like, no politics, no picking sides, universal brotherhood. But when the wars broke out, then you had to say this more and more. They started to argue, whose side are you on? So this definitely dashed a lot of the dreams they had there. And of course, they went on in their own ways, including Steiner went on in his own way. But right at the beginning of the war, he's breaking from theosophy. because of this Krishnamurti thing that he does talk about. That's one of his main reasons for doing it. So in terms of so there's two parts to this. There's a methodology that Steiner develops throughout his life which he calls Geisteswissenschaft, spiritual science. Anthroposophy is like the name of the spiritual being, Anthroposophia, who leads the movement. But the occult teachings, which are philosophical development teachings, they refer to as Geisteswissenschaft, which in English we translate spiritual science, which really is the same word for the humanities, though. There's Geisteswissenschaft and there's Naturwissenschaft. And there were lots of other people talking about Geisteswissenschaft at the time who meant the humanities. And Steiner does also kind of mean that. He's just also, in the humanities for him is also esotericism and occultism, which at the time was not. But funnily enough, it's starting to be like that now. I mean, my colleagues are in the study of esotericism and we're in the humanities. So, so in this occult schooling that he has, definitely this philosophy of individualist anarchist thing remains a part of it. Mm-hmm. He then, though, has this whole project, which is related to the Theosophists, about democratizing esotericism, putting the occult ideas out into the world instead of keeping them to just a closed circle of elites. And through this process, he's really involved in creating new social impulses or social ideas and putting them into practice, Mm-hmm. So in that process, he does then, after in the midst of World War I and after, come to the political and the economic, and there and the schooling he comes to, those definitely remain individual anarchist. For example, in the schooling, one of the main points of that schooling, which again was popular at the time, it's not necessarily just coming from him, but he was also doing this. The whole point was to free it from state and from top-down control, that the teachers themselves formed a kind of democratic coalition or group within the school itself, and they voted about the curriculum. They made the decisions this way rather than from top-down authority from the state about what should be taught. In fact, in the Waldorf schools, one of the things that students are supposed to do, the young students, is create their own textbook. So this is definitely part of this same impulse of it's just reversing it, from the bottom up rather than from the top down.
Yeah. This all seems sorry, go ahead.
Well, just to finish that thought, so there you get both here. He never left this individuality thing, and that this is the road in freeing the self completely in a very much a Stirnerian way is the road to mystical enlightenment for him, for sure. However, he then makes political projects later, like this threefold movement, which we could talk about, which are more they're more communal focused. I mean, he definitely then was interested in community at the same time, which I guess Stirner also was in his own way, but in Steiner's way, it's not that different actually. So the one leads to the other. This is, I guess, what I'm trying to say.
Well, before we get to the threefolding, I just want to. This all seems a little bit utopian. So you move from the individualist anarchism, and obviously there is a emphasis on the individual. But at the same time, there is, there is Waldorf schools, there is teaching and teachers, and there is education, there is community. So there is a sort of Steinerian utopian vision.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that's a contradiction. I'm not saying that. I'm just wondering what that's.
Well, I don't think he would call it that, I suppose. But in a certain sense, there is like spiritual community. I mean, there are definitely guidelines for how to achieve. I don't think the only reason why I'd say it's not utopian is because he never stops talking about something like the demons and Ahriman coming and wreaking havoc on everyone. And then when they say things like, in one lecture in particular, his followers are like, "Oh, you're telling us this demon is going to incarnate. Should we all go hide in a commune?" And he says, "No, you have to go out there into society and face it."
Yeah.
So that's why I guess I would resist the utopian label a little bit. Nevertheless, he definitely has this intentional community idea, and that community is supposed to be a kind of cooperative, but spiritual, environment. Of course, there were many people with similar ideas, and some of those, when you actually put that into practice, we could bring out all kinds of people from coming out of these communities who had the opposite experience of some authoritarian running the community and just having bad experiences like that. And so I just mentioned that because the anthroposophical movement, it's not like they just did it and succeeded. They also have that problem,
it's something to mention here before we move to the threefolding. Is that, as we were mentioning right at the beginning of this explosive time, well, I think one thing to bear in mind, you mentioned that we mentioned the title of those letters was Anarchists as Murderers. I mean, we think of anarchists today possibly as maybe some small fringe student group that people get over after their 20s or whatever, or become disillusioned by, but ultimately it's someone giving out pamphlets on the streets. At this point in time, I mean, anarchists are quite literally assassinating people. This is very much a thing that is happening. But one other thing to mention with respect to this time, two other sort of concurrent threads that are not only there culturally, but are fully being expanded upon and written about by thinkers, would be technology. So someone such as Junger is writing about total mobilization with relation to war, and also his book Das Arbeiter, the worker, Dominion and Form. So this underlying notion of an understanding that as culture moves into this technologically quantified world, that man and machine, man and quantification are having a blending, are merging in some sense. And someone like Gurdjieff at the same time is saying man is literally a machine. And on the other hand, amidst that is really I don't want to say the dawn of the modern economy fully, because it would be a few years before, more so sort of with the Industrial Revolution. But here, with regards to war, with regards to more modern technologies, I think it would seem that people are now beginning to have a much more direct relationship to economic forces. I mean, as we move into the Weimar Republic, people are going to be eventually in the early 30s late 20s, sorry, wheeling around wheelbarrows full of money because hyperinflation has. So, this notion of the economy as we understand it now, I think, is really, really setting its roots at this point as well. So those things are happening. So, and this leads us into freefolding and mudding with Steiner.
Yeah, absolutely. And those are important to keep in mind, especially this thing about terrorism, because anarchy and terrorism, why that even became a thing was because there had been these workers organizing in the 19th century, and they were organizing for 8-hour work days and for higher wages. And we know the story. So this was all happening in the 19th century, and this is kind of split into Marxist groups, socialist groups, and anarchist groups of all kinds of different flavors. And
conservatives.
And conservatives. Yeah. That's true, right. Yeah. So it spawned this whole really quite insane, I have to say, time from, I guess it's about the mid-19th century until, World War I, where these things are exploding, especially in Germany. They're exploding after the war, when they finally get some kind of revolution, or at least a mutiny, and then they try to do more revolutions, and then, how to actually pull that off successfully, or how does that even done, and who should do it? Yes, and so in that one, just to mention Steiner's idea about anarchism, he was definitely in the pacifist anarchist mold in the 1890s, and so was Mackay. So they were together in this, writing against these anarchists that were becoming more and more, seeming to become more and more focused on direct violent action, or at least the propaganda der Tat. That just means create some kind of explosion to get people's attention. And there's a history for why that was too, because there were several already kind of revolutions, one that happened, or attempted revolutions, like in France and the Paris Commune, also in the US, which these movements were just bloodily put down. So a lot of people then thought, oh, this isn't going to work, pacifism, they will just shoot us all. So we have to resort to some kind of new methods that involve violence. So that's what was happening, but you still had these anarchists pushing against it too, these so-called pacifist anarchists. And Steiner, he's in this mold. I guess the reason I say all that is because that is all, in a certain sense, about economics. You know what I mean? Because it's the workers who are organizing these things. One of the things the anarchists then come up with is the idea of the strike. But when the strike goes this way it did in Chicago in the 1880s, with this other massacre that happened, this then is also having the same kind of kind of problems, So Steiner is right there in the middle of that, but he is so to bring it up a little bit more, after he wrote these books in the mid 1890s, before he joined, well, actually at the time when he joined the Theosophical Society, or if better said, he became the general secretary of it, he was teaching in the proletariat school in Berlin, the communist workers' school, as he was teaching religious studies, comparative religion, and other things. And he was always having debates with the socialists, and it's really not clear how much he sympathized or not. I mean, he definitely criticizes them, but he also sympathized with the proletariat cause for sure. So it's that's a long, complicated history. But there, he's always in some lectures later and during World War I, he talks about how he was trying to get this notion of freedom across to the socialists, and the socialists were always interested more in how revolutionary, the pacifists are not revolutionary enough, they're just going, if you just focus on the individual, how are we going to organize the workers? So there's this back and forth, which still exists today, I think, between Marxists and anarchists. So Steiner was on this freedom, Stirner, pacifist side. But as we mentioned, he then becomes a theosophist, and while he still holds those ideals, and he even says at one point that he sees no conflict between socialism and theosophy. For him, the two worked together. When World War I broke out, this rearranged a lot of things. And then there was the November Revolution after the war. And at that point, the aristocracy and the Kaiser were fled, and there was this society was just deteriorating, really. And there was this power vacuum. And so this is where you had different kind of revolutionary groups and conservatives, as you mentioned, the military guys. I don't know what Junger was doing at this time. You'd know better than me, but definitely some of Junger's comrades joined this conservative side, the chauvinist side. So they were all vying for power. And Steiner has this idea, has his own political project, definitely inspired by these other ones, or at least he tried to critically put, attached to them, more positive, more sympathetically put, join his ideas in with what was happening, because he thought that what he saw was happening, including amongst these socialist and communist revolutions, was not going to work. And so he wanted it to work. And so he was bringing his own ideas to these revolutionary activities. But again, he was a pacifist, so he obviously was not interested in the violent takeover part. But more than anything, what he says was missing was a spiritual outlook. For him at this point, especially, you couldn't do any of this radical reorganizing of society for the workers' cause, which he supported all of that stuff. But it had to have a spiritual, esoteric component to it for him. And so that's what he was bringing. So he comes up with this, I don't know if he comes up with, but he develops this idea called, which in English we translate as social threefolding. The threefold social organism is kind of the literal translation. And this is an idea for how to reorganize society in a more fair, just, to give it the things that he saw these revolutionary people wanting, the workers especially. But also there were business owners too, so you had this was the problem. You have the state, you have the corporations or the business owners, the landed wealth, and then you have all these workers, So he was trying, I suppose he was even, I think he puts it this way in some places, find a middle position between, capitalism and communist revolution, somehow a way to organize it so that it avoided what was happening there and somehow fixed what he saw going on around him. And it was really a horrible, bloody time. I mean, these leftists were being murdered, the revolutionaries, and Steiner does actually have sympathy for them in his lectures. You can see it. I know a lot of people would like to think otherwise, but you can go read his lectures and see that what he was trying to connect with Kurt Eisner, for example. He said that it was very tragic when Rosa Luxemburg was murdered, So he did have sympathy with these people. It's just that his whole thing at this point was spirituality and mysticism had to be brought into the workings of the society to solve this problem. And so his project for that, which I can say more about if you want, is he calls threefold social order. Threefold social organism. The word organism should give it away, at least to some extent. What he means.
Please go into this threefold social organism.
Okay, so the organism part means it's a kind of living society rather than abstract, dead idea of the state or something like that, viewing it in a more holistic way. And I would say that the way that this is developed is not developed to the extent that actual political activists and revolutionaries would be satisfied with. And that could partly be because Steiner was developing about 10 different things at once here. He's like, new religion, new kind of schooling, new building we're going to make in Switzerland. Like, he's doing like so many different things at once that the feeling is almost like people are interested in these things and he's interested in them, and he's coming up with ideas and giving out ideas, you know. He does develop a system, but like some critiques against it are that's like, where do you actually go with this? Like, how do you put this into practice? That's also one of the critiques why perhaps it's never really been. There's been some places that have done some experiments with it, but it never like took off. Like, for example, the Waldorf school did. You know, those things are out worldwide; they're functioning. You know, but it's based on a very foundational idea. First of all, that it's a living organism that you're involved in creating, and this threefold idea is, of course, the most important part. So that the society should be divided into three separate but interrelated spheres. So the people who supported this movement back in at the time in Germany at the end of the war would wear basically what is the peace sign now. So you have these three rings, or you have this ring circle split into three, and in each one of those is a different sphere of activity, but they're all connected to this organism. You know, we're all part of this living thing. And the threefold idea here is this is bringing in the esotericism. So it's a microcosm, macrocosm. So the human being for the esotericists, the Steinerian esotericists, is not body and soul. First of all, it's not just body. It's not body and soul. It's body, soul, and spirit. So these three components. This is then mirrored in the organization of the society, which is separated into the economic sphere, the legal sphere, and basically the spiritual sphere, but this doesn't translate well into English, but the sphere that's like the arts, culture, science, these kinds of things, culture, you know. So these three spheres are separated and have their own autonomy rather than being squashed together. And this is partly a reaction to the imperial state in Germany under the Kaiser, because at that point, all those three things were smushed together. Like, the best example of that is education. That's why he tried to like remove state economic interests in education, because at that point, the schooling is about making a person spiritual, you know, or Geist in German. It just means developed, you know, developing your mind, your intellect. But then you had the state demanding like basically anti-early socialist forms of education, so the education had to be anti-socialist somehow. So you had the state involved in it. And then you had the corporations and the money and the profits involved that became more and more a problem, especially towards World War I. So there's like the idea that these three spheres were so smushed together that they needed to be liberated and function independently. So that's like the foundational idea. And just I have a couple things to say about it here that maybe will make it more clear. So he forms an organization to try to get this off the ground, this movement, and he publishes an announcement in all of the radical journals, including the most radical ones in Munich, and in the more I guess mainstream ones too. But he's publishing them in these radical, what I would call leftist journals, about this new organization. And he publishes a book that is later translated into English as Basic Issues of the Social Question. So even here, the social question that I mentioned at the beginning is this is where this is coming from. And so in this scheme, and he did get a lot of attraction and attention even from the revolutionaries. In this scheme, the economic sphere, according to Steiner, should operate in terms of the principle of fraternity. So that means they're like almost like not like more merchant type bartering, like contractual exchange based on like a more a fraternal ethic rather than like an ethic of profit or something like that. The legal realm should be oriented toward equality. And then the artistic, scientific, or cultural realm, this should be founded on the principle of freedom.
Mm.
And that's kind of the most important, that this absolute freedom of individual expression is like the key to making all of these other ones work for him. And for example, one quote he says, this is later in 1923, when this is still ongoing, but some of the heat has died down. He says, quote, "In the old days, there were slaves. The entire human being was sold as commodity. Today, capitalism is the power through which still a remnant of the human being, the labor power, is stamped with the character of a commodity." End quote. So for him, that is the problem, which is the problem of these workers' revolutions. But this is his way of solving it, is this like microcosm, macrocosm, more esoteric ideas.
What happens to money in there? Because I believe he has a particular idea about money within this
Right.
refolding.
Yeah, he says he says that money should be perishable, basically, that because everything's like an organism, like nothing is supposed to be, I guess, abstract in this case. So even money has like a life cycle, or it's a living thing. And he does go, I don't know this that well, but just to give you a basic idea, that he does go into this thing about how the money should be used within this cycle, that there's like young money, then there's like middle-aged money, and then there's old money. And then when the money does die, and when it dies, it has to be then redeposited as a gift or something like that. So in other, like the young money is used to trade for goods based on raw materials. When this young money is then turned into like a venture or an initiative, this becomes like a more corporate entity, kind of like an industrial entity. This is like the middle age of the money. Some of that has to go back into the land, the agriculture, the raw materials, in order to make that work. But what I think he's against is this idea of then that becoming like investment money, and like surplus wealth, like generational wealth. Like this is the stuff he's trying to do away with that part of it. So he says that there can be some of that to the extent that it serves the community and that they all agree on it, But otherwise, the money then needs to be turned into a gift at the end of its life and redeposited, sort of like recycled, basically back into the system. And for him, obviously, where would we make these gifts most important? In this spiritual sphere. So rather than it all like lingering over there in the economic sphere or something, it has to be put back into fund these initiatives in this what's supposed to be a totally free sphere of expression and artistic creativity and science and so on.
I mean, it all makes sense. How was it? It obviously didn't cotton on, but how was it appreciated in the day?
Yeah, it's a funny history. Mixed, yeah, and it's still mixed, I would say. I mean, some critics try to show that it had, especially this organism part, is somehow related to past, more conservative ideas of the way a society is structured, like hierarchies and things like that. Even though he definitely is not, at least what he said, he definitely doesn't necessarily put it that way. You did have a lot of, I guess you would call like a communist or socialist leftist, new left intellectuals in the 20th century picking up these ideas, and there are still some of these around in Berlin who are basically people who are these radical leftists, but they're Steiner people too. But like none of it really went anywhere other than like within the anthroposophical circles. However, the anthroposophical circles did spread. So there were like some banks set up. There are anthroposophical banks in Switzerland, and they try to experiment with these ideas and fund these initiatives and like try to work with Steiner's ideas. I mean, at the time when he published this book, the basic social issues of the social question, this is right in the thick of it when these revolutions are happening, when Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht are killed, assassinated, Gustav Landauer, and Kurt Eisner are assassinated in Munich. I mean, these things are happening right when he publishes this book. And in this paper that I just published that I mentioned, I tried to show that more recently, critical positions of Steiner have tried to emphasize how the leftists didn't like him or take him seriously because of the spiritual stuff, but that wasn't my findings. And so I tried to show how many of the people who are actively involved in these radical revolutionary movements were interested in what Steiner had to say, and some of them were like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. There needs to be some kind of spiritual component to this whole thing. There were also some who criticized him who were kind of basically an atheist. A lot of anarchists are known to be sort of from this atheist position. So there was definitely that idea. And Steiner was accused of being everything from a Jew to a communist to a Jesuit to, people just could accuse him of being all these things. And so he was always up against that too. So it was a very mixed bag, but it was definitely had positive reception too. And then it sort of went on to live its own, I guess, anthroposophical life, and it's still around. Like they're still actively trying to put some of these ideas into practice within the Anthroposophical Society.
What is it? Is there a purpose for the individual man politically? What Steiner would say for the individual man to do? Read Philosophy of Freedom?
Yeah, right. Yeah, probably he would center him in this cultural, spiritual art poet realm. The Philosophy of Freedom is intended to basically free the individual from, this is where it's like Stirner a bit, free the individual from outside compulsions and hindrances, but also from the inner ones that you have. Even perceptual ones. Like his book, it goes pretty far that there's like a perceptual hindrance from the way we view reality, that you have to overcome that through what he calls like pure thinking. And this is where you then get into the spiritual stuff. So like if I were to, he has so many different ideas, it's hard for me to say, but if I were to just pick something that he would be likely to agree with, perhaps it's that the purpose of the human being, even politically, is art, is creative, is expressing the true individuality of what you are, uninhibited, unrestrained, like the essence of the individual. Because it's this, once you do that for him, it's not just you anymore. This is why it's not thought to be like a selfish thing, even though it could be argued that there's elements of that. As soon as this sort of free expression occurs, it's then reconnects with like the ground of being, of the world all, which is all people, all things. And so you then have this, theoretically, I suppose, a different kind of mode of being, Like, for example, one of the things he says when he was having critiques about his threefolding idea, about like, how is this going to fix the problem now? They're shooting people in the streets. He says somewhere something like, his is not like an instrumental fixing like that what in his system, the people would be educated or developed in such a way that wouldn't then be a problem anymore. So there is this this reorganization idea and this focus on liberating the individual in such a way somehow that is for him the purpose, and then that produces more utopic, or at least more better society.
Yeah, and this is a spiritual thread at the time, and we see this specifically with Gurdjieff as well, but it's a spiritual thread that I think carries through this notion of, the masses, and, this question of why is there ongoing wars? Why do we never learn? The spiritual side seems to revert back to nothing can change until the individual changes. Or, almost as if, almost really to say, all those questions are complete nonsense until individuals turn inwards,
And that's why there's a tension, because that's the anarchists are saying that, and a lot of spiritual groups are saying that, and there's this tension between the two of them about their resonances for sure, but can these fit together? Do they fit together, Yeah, so even at that time, this was a debate. The only place I know of where something called mystical anarchism did develop for a little bit was in Russia, but I think it was just one movement. So that an official movement sort of labeling itself that, you know what I mean? Yeah. It was at this time though.
Is there anything you'd like to add about this general discussion that you feel is key?
Maybe just one last thing about Steiner that I didn't get to put in there, and this is how he says he got to his more spiritual place from this more, philosophical or an anarchist, even though I wouldn't call him an atheist at the time. But he was close. He was a quasi-materialist at this time too, but didn't mean he didn't have these Goethean ideas that were more romantic or something. So that's another ongoing debate about did Steiner become an atheist in the 1890s or not. But there's the best way I thought to do this was, if we have time, I could just read one more quote here. And this is actually from a contemporary of Steiner's named Gustav Landauer. And Landauer was another anarchist thinker, and he was I think he was a little bit younger than Steiner, but he was around right at the same time. And he was assassinated, as I mentioned, during this Bavarian Council Republic revolution, but he participated with that. But his ideas are very similar to Steiner's, even though they didn't have a direct relationship, and I don't even know if they liked each other, but they had some similar ideas. But the way that Landauer describes, the way that this is described about Landauer explains what happened to Steiner in the 1890s. So that's why I want to read it. And this is because Steiner turned out to be a kind of mystical anarchist, in my opinion. And he was also, therefore, like esoterically anti-capitalist, if I can put it that way. But this is a quote from a paper, from an article entitled "A Reflection on Mystical Anarchism in the Works of Gustav Landauer and Eric Voegelin" by Franziska Hoppen in the book Essays in Anarchism and Religion, Volume 1. So this is, the author is explaining Gustav Landauer's ideas, but they apply, in my opinion, directly to what Steiner says he went through in the 1890s. So here's the quote. Landauer concluded that the world, or ground of being, implicating those realms that lie beyond sense experience, intellect, and reason, is not something outside of the individual that can be explored from the separated position of the observer, but that it is rather already within the individual. The experience of being the world, participating in the ground of being, what Steiner refers to as the world all, that's me putting that in, this renders a distinction between an inside and an outside, an objective and a subjective, superfluous. The deeper the individual dives into himself, becoming the world, the more she also separates herself from the arche of reality, like the laws and rules, with its supposed isolated, concrete, and autonomous bodies that form society. It is an anarchist inward movement. Landauer referred to this process of reuniting with the true reality as separation from false reality, which constitutes simultaneously a form of self-annihilation, because the imaginative I kills itself so that the world I can live. End quote. So in Steiner's biography, he talks about this period right before joining Theosophy, after he was doing everything with Mackay, teaching at this school, writing his Philosophy of Freedom books. And he describes it as reaching a kind of abyss in his thinking, an end point that was like a crossing the threshold. I would call it a kind of form of self-annihilation. That's why I'm putting that here. It's like he'd taken this line to the end, and he calls it an abyss, an experience of the abyss in his autobiography. And it's after this experience, also in Berlin at this time, according to his biography, that he then has a mystical experience of what he calls the mystery of Golgotha, the kind of esoteric Christian cosmic Christ theme that became so popular for him later. So it's like he takes himself to this self-annihilation position through his philosophy, his radical individualistic philosophy, according to him, has this mystical experience, which is this reconnecting moment, what Landauer calls this reuniting with the true reality. And then after that, his life is dedicated to these spiritual topics. So for him, he sees this progression, but that's a bit hard for people to understand. How could you possibly reach that by becoming more and more a materialist or an anarchist? How could you suddenly then pop out as an esoteric Christian? But I think that there is a path here that's being described, and Landauer is also hinting at it. And I think that's at least the way I read Steiner's transition phase.
Okay. I'm not sure what to add to that one.
Yeah, I don't know if there needs to be, but I wanted to make sure that we kind of understood this moment here. Yeah.
Okay. So what, other than Philosophy of Freedom, obviously we've got your own article, which is you can read online, I believe, which I'll link in the description below. But what else would you recommend people read in relation to this discussion?
Yeah, as I mentioned, his thing he published at the end of World War I, The Basic Issues of the Social Question. You could read that. And there's actually something online that I think people would find interesting. It's 3 lectures that he gave in 1920. And it's, if you just look up the history and actuality of imperialism, this is 3 lectures, and it's published on the Southern Cross Review website. So these 3 lectures are quite interesting and revealing, and it's a good translation. So I would also recommend people look those up. And if you could read German, there's a really good book by Norwegian. It's a Norwegian writer. This was part of this was translated into German, named Kai Skagen, and he has a book called Anarchist, Individualist, Mystiker, Rudolf Steiner's Early Years, 1897 to 1902.
All right. There's a lot of, I'll find links for those things, put them in the description below. And you're currently working on another paper on Steiner.
More Steiner stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, other than that, seems like a good place to finish up. All right, French. Thanks once.
Thank you.